America is the superpower it is today partly because of immigration, whether it be from the British Isles or Cuba. The influx of immigrants during the Gilded Age from various European countries forever changed American culture in large urban cities and rural areas. The Gilded Age saw millions of immigrants step onto the American shores with completely different origins compared to their previous immigrants. Clash between the rise of urbanization and diversity of immigration set the stage for a cultural transformation in many areas of the country. Colonial immigration refers to the time period of 1600 to 1776. According to a census conducted in the 18th century, around 900,000 immigrants came to the colonies during this time period. This period of immigration saw settlers come from the British Isles and Germany for the most part. The largest group of immigrants came from Africa as enslaved persons, and this massive forced migration created the African American culture that would influence the country in so many ways with years to come. The men and women who journeyed to America during this time period swore allegiance to the British Crown and established settlements across the eastern seaboard. The establishment of settlements was not a simple task by any means, and settlements like Roanoke and Jamestown either failed or were on the brink of failure. Nevertheless, the flow of immigration from the British Isles to America during this time period formed the base of the American population that would expand with yet more immigration from Europe. Old immigration refers to the period of immigration from 1800 to 1880. The 19th century saw the numbers of immigrants inflate from 900,000 in the 170-year colonial period to over 10 million in just a 90-year span. A large amount of these 10 million immigrants, 5.5 million to be exact, left their native country of Ireland and made the journey to America. The spark of Irish immigration can be explained by the Irish potato famine, which displaced millions of Irish men and women. These Irish citizens were often unskilled and not built for an industrializing country and were looked down upon by other white citizens. Germans flooded the new country in similar numbers, but were not similar to the Irish, to say the least. German immigrants were, for the most part, skilled workers, farmers, and shopkeepers, and were, for the most part, fairly wealthy. Other groups of immigrants included the Chinese and the Japanese, who were crucial in the construction of the American railroad system in the mid-19th century. Immigrants in the 19th century faced problems adjusting to American culture. Irish immigrants were, for the most part, uneducated and discriminated against by the majority white population. Chinese immigrants were never considered to be a part of American culture and were also heavily discriminated against. New immigration refers to the time period of around 1880 to 1920 that brought a change in the demographics of the immigrants that went through Ellis Island by the hundreds of thousands each year. The prospects of streets paved with gold and the rise of industrialization in America was recognized in Europe, and by 1880, the number of immigrants that arrived in America swelled to a colossal 5 million. Before this period, a majority of immigrants came from the British Isles and Western Europe. The new immigration era saw an explosion of immigration from southeastern Europe, countries such as Poland, Greece, Italy, and other Baltic countries. This rise in southern European immigration can be explained by economic reasons, where citizens of southern European countries saw employment in their native countries dwindle and economic opportunities across the Atlantic rise. Whereas previous British immigrants were mostly literate and somewhat wealthy, these new immigrants were neither wealthy or literate and often unskilled. These immigrants were also neither Protestant nor Catholic, but mostly Eastern Orthodox. Unlike previous immigrants, a good portion of the new immigrants crowded congested urban areas such as New York and Chicago. Unskilled immigrants took industrial jobs in factories and worked off of very low wages. As a result of this, factory wages for all employees fell and the immigrants were looked down upon. These new immigrants carried a culture that was not common in the United States at that specific period of time. Nativism. Irish Catholic immigration in the 1830s sparked a movement of nativism, or the political opposition of demanding a favored status for certain established inhabitants of a nation as compared to claims of newcomers or immigrants. Southeastern European immigrants in 1880 evoked the same nativist response because of high birth rates, low standards of living, and worries that the original Anglo-Saxon stock would soon be outbred and outvoted. Most people didn't believe in a melting pot forming in the United States, but rather something less pleasing. Immigrants were blamed for the degradation of the urban environment and mostly the effect of cheap labor from these immigrants. Organizations formed to express Nativist fears, including the APA, which was created in 1887 and soon reached over 1 million members. Congress responded to these concerns by implementing restrictions on immigration, including the abolishment of immigrants that were criminals from arriving on American shores. The Know Nothing Party. Know Nothing Party was a political faction that formed through nativist feelings of many in New York in the 1850s. It was empowered by popular fears that the country was being overwhelmed by German and Irish Catholic immigrants who were often regarded as hostile to Republican values and controlled by the Pope in Rome. Mainly active from 1854 to 1856, the Know Nothing Party strove to curb immigration and naturalization, though its efforts met with little success. Millard Fillmore ran for the presidential seat through this party in the 1850s. The Chinese Exclusion Act. Another example of legislation that functioned by excluding immigrants from American society. The Chinese Exclusion Act excluded Chinese skilled and unskilled laborers employed in mining from entering the country for 10 years under a penalty of imprisonment and deportation. Most citizens never considered the Chinese to be actual citizens and never saw the possibility of the Chinese assimilating into American culture. The Chinese were pivotal in the construction of the thousands of miles of railroads that were being constructed during this time period. National Origins Act, also called the Immigration Act of 1824. This act limited the annual number of immigrants who could be admitted from any country to 2% of the number of people from that country who were already living in the United States in 1890, down from the 3% cap set by the Immigration Restriction Act of 1921, according to a census in 1890. This act aimed to reduce Jewish and Polish immigration that had flooded American cities starting in 1880. This act was later revised in 1929, changing the immigration quota from 2% to simply 150,000 immigrants. The melting pot theory. The melting pot is a metaphor for the combination of ethnic backgrounds that make up a country's populace. The melting pot theory has been applied to mainly to the Americas because the United States of America is one of the only countries at the forefront of vast cultural heterogeneity. This melting pot theory relates closely to the concept of cultural assimilation, which is defined as the process of integration where people from different cultures and nationalities are accepted into a society as part of their people, and the exchange of cultural practices takes place. During the Gilded Age, it was hard to see a melting pot forming in the United States because of the amount of discrimination that the Jewish and Polish immigrants faced during the 19th century. Despite this, these immigrants were soon accepted into American society, and the emergence of intermarriage between different ethnic backgrounds enforced the melting pot theory. Assimilation theory. Assimilation refers to the process by which an immigrant's native language and culture are superseded by the language and culture of the country that the immigrant is migrating to. Assimilation as a theory claims that immigrants completely assimilate to the culture, and the result is a homogeneous cultural base that is free of variety. In the case of the Gilded Age immigration, the assimilation theory did not hold much weight during the initial wave of new immigration in the early 20th century because immigrants made a great effort to preserve their cultural heritage and tried to not to completely assimilate into the American culture. This resistance lost power as time progressed to a point in which later generations of new immigrants completely assimilated into American culture. Pluralism theory. Pluralism is the idea that immigrants who migrate to a new country preserve their culture and ideals. Pluralism as a theory claims that a country has heterogeneous cultural base that consists of ideals from multiple origins. Gilded Age immigration introduced a new ethnic variety that carried different cultural ideals. Pluralism was very strong when immigrants first arrived to the United States, as ethnic neighborhoods such as Little Italy and Little Poland propped up in urban areas such as New York and Chicago. Jewish and Polish immigrants made a strong effort to preserve their cultural ideals, but future generations would not work as strongly to preserve these ideals, and these generations of immigrants started to assimilate into American society.
Developed in 1867 by Oliver Kelly, the National Grange of the Patrons of Husbandry was created in an effort to benefit all farmers through any hard times that they could face. Farmers faced many difficulties, but the National Grange did alleviate some pressure through practices such as collective sharing of bought machinery. Business practices at the time, such as pooling, where companies came to agreements with each other to split the amount of business between them, put even more pressure on farmers, as rates were unregulated. The Grangers also used tactics like voting for a single candidate as a group of farmers, something called block voting. Through political action, the Grangers managed to pass state legislation, Granger state laws, in states like Illinois and Iowa that regulated prices of storing grain and railroads. This was appealed to the Supreme Court in the case Mon v. Illinois, where it was established that private industry used by the public can be regulated by the government. In his majority opinion, Chief Justice Waite stated, quote, "After what has already been said, it is unnecessary to refer at length to the effect of the other provision of the 14th Amendment, which is relied upon, viz., that no state shall, quote, deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws," end quote. Certainly it cannot be claimed that this prevents the state from regulating the fares of hackmen or the charges of draymen in Chicago, unless it does the same thing in every other place within its jurisdiction. But, as has been seen, the power to regulate the business of warehouses depends upon the same principle as the power to regulate hackmen and draymen, and what cannot." End quote. The public utility view of the railroads did not last long, as the decision in Munn v. Illinois was reversed with the decision in the Wabash case, where it was decided that the interstate commerce could only be regulated by the federal government. In the attempt to regulate this interstate commerce, Congress passed the Interstate Commerce Act in 1887, which outlawed numerous business practices like pools and forced the open posting of railroad rates. Other acts, such as the Sherman Antitrust Act, passed in 1890, attempted to regulate businesses further, as certain business practices, such as trade restraint, became illegal. While these two pieces of legislation may not have achieved the anticipated results, as businesses found ways to evade the two acts or negate any negative ramifications, this did mark the beginning to large intervention by the government into business. Unions during this period began to gain ground as well. Tactics such as collective bargaining, where employees, often in unions, negotiate over wages and conditions with their employer, were employed, but to little initial success. Organizations such as the Knights of Labor also gained ground. The Knights of Labor incorporated workers across numerous professions in a single union. This showed its effectiveness in 1885, when a massive strike was held against the Wabash Railroad. The American Federation of Labor was similar in some respects. It wasn't a single organization, but rather a conglomeration of labor unions, able to unify the unions in a single approach. Opting for social rather than political reform, the American Federation of Labor was effective in long strikes as it could sustain long strikes through increased funds. Other unions, such as the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, also effectively used strikes to gain better working conditions and wages. Numerous reformers were present during the Gilded Age. Thomas Nast used political cartoons to push reform. He ran cartoons through newspapers against figures such as Boss Tweed, criticizing the corruption of Tweed. Jane Addams, another reformer of the time period, advocated for women's rights. She was integral in the path toward women's suffrage and against war. She, along with others, created Hull House, a settlement house aimed at providing social benefits for the poor, in 1889. For her efforts in social reform, Jane Addams won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931.